I wish more people knew how amazing Amiga and its unique library of exclusive titles was. Sure, some games may have been more interesting than good per se, but if that's not the reason to learn about them, I don't know what is. Anyway, enough of me preaching, let's jump straight into it. When it released at the tail end of 1994, Shadow Fighter was easily the best exclusive versus fighting game on the Amiga. Arguably better playing and running than Amiga's port of Street Fighter 2 and better looking than that of Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers. But when it came to original, system-unique titles, there was nothing that could compare to it. Body Blows games had graphics, and graphics alone, as the characters had very limited set of moves, and its gameplay was rather stiff, repeatable, unbalanced and not fun. Shadow Fighter is probably the best Street Fighter on the Amiga that's technically not a Street Fighter at all. It features 16 uniquely looking and very differently playing to each other characters and appropriate for them stages. Well, 17 if you count the training dummy, but I don't. 25 moves per fighter, up to 5 flash-in explosive special attacks each, and even an optional blood, for those who prefer the Mortal Kombats to the Street Fighters. And I never saw how the game looked like without it on. So, Shadow Fighter is a game for all. Presentation-wise, it's all top tier. The sprites are large and smoothly animated, backgrounds are very different from one another too, chock full of detail and perhaps even more colorful than the characters are. Overall, it looks fantastic. Sounds and music are genre appropriate, well fitting to the on-screen action, but otherwise nothing out of ordinary. I mean, it's punches, jabs and kicks, so other than the occasional super special shout, they sound similar to those in other games. All that said, a very important question comes to mind. Is Shadow Fighter as good of a game as Street Fighter 2 in the arcades was? It's not, but it's damn close, and way better than any of the Body Blows games were on the Amiga. There's no comparison between these. One is a novel, fun and deep versus fighter, and another is Body Blows. Pole Walki, which loosely translates to Battlefield, is an obscure Polish, rather average turn-based strategy. While it's entirely in Polish and henceforth some gaming concepts may be slightly gated by the language barrier, if you give it a little time and some trial and error, you'll get the hang of it. Question is it worth the effort? Well, if you're a fan of the tactical turn-based strategy genre, then it may be. At the very least to learn all its mechanics, figure it all out and make your own mind about it. But if you're not, then you may just very well skip it and jump to our next game. Anyway, up to 4 players can battle it out in Pole Walki at once, be it player or CPU controlled, and everything takes place on a large scrolling top-down battlefield map. Each player starts with their own base and the same amount of funds to spend on one of the 6 types of mech units, and various equipment for them too. They all differ in stats of armor, firepower, shot range, capacity and current damage status, with the last one only being used while playing, as brand new, shiny and freshly purchased mechs are obviously undamaged. Each turn a player can buy equipment and issue orders to all units. This can be move, attack, repair, dig in for defense or even request for air support. Naturally, defeating enemies and finding rich natural resource caches adds to your funds, so the better you do, the more you have to spend on your mechs. Pole Walki is an interesting, even if unspectacular game. If you like strategies, especially those more methodical and tactical, then it may be worth tracking down and trying it out. But if you're not really into this, ignore it. There are better, more accessible and in English games out there. Screech is a top-down arcade racer not unlike the famous supercars. It features quite a few fun and often tricky tracks that will require you to give it your best, fast and action-packed racing, and most importantly 10 cars on the screen at once. Now, you may think that's unimpressive, cause 10 is actually not that much and we have games now that could easily display dozens of these in high-res and high detail, but back then, on the Amiga, in most top-down racers, 4 to 6 was a standard, with that lower number being the more common one. Additionally, having all 10 at once meant that they were smaller and by extension of that the tracks were more zoomed out, so much bigger chunks of them were clearly visible at once. So, fast racing, while not easy per se, was in fact a bit easier than in other titles, where in most cases the viewpoint was heavily zoomed in. Many of the tracks feature shortcuts, which can make or break your race. And while there's no weapons in Screech to speak of, it doesn't mean that it's blunt or boring. No, there are water and oil spills everywhere, seemingly randomized but often feeling like in the worst possible spot, and from time to time a pedestrian will, for whatever the reasons, show up on the track and when driven over will leave oddly satisfying bloody tracks. Screech may not be as big, feature-rich and well-known as Supercars was, but it's an excellent fun little racer nonetheless, that 2 of you can have fun in on a single Amiga. Its presentation is quite good too. Graphics are nice and colorful, and while the sprites are rather small, for cars, pedestrians and most roadside objects they are nicely detailed and clearly a lot of attention was given to them. Sounds are okay, and that's as much as I can say about them. They're there and they fit. Screech is perhaps one of the many overhead racers on the Amiga, but despite being rather unknown, it's a good one and well worth your time. Xtreme Racing is what Mario Kart on the Amiga would be if it ever released without licensing Nintendo's famous characters. It offers 8 different racers to choose from, each uniquely looking and with its own vehicle and playstyle. Up to 4 players can play on a single system, or 8 when 2 systems are connected via null modem or an RS-232 cables. Sounds like a bit troublesome approach, but I suppose that if you manage to gather 8 eager gamers in one room back then, it had to be hella fun. There are 3 gameplay modes in single player: a cup, where you compete for points in one of 4 cups, each consisting of 5 tracks; the tournament mode, in which apart from trying to be the first, you also race for money that can be used to purchase upgrades for the forthcoming races; and finally, the time trial, which kinda explains itself quite well. What's worth noting about it, however, is that it's a pure time attack mode where there are no opponents to compete against whatsoever. In multiplayer, a definitely most entertaining way to play the game, there are 4 modes overall. First 2 are the same as in single player, so cup and tournament, and the latter 2 being versus, in which you race head-to-head on a chosen track, and battle mode, which is a mixture of Nintendo's Super Mario Kart and Street Racers gameplay. Interestingly enough, released in 1996 upgrade pack not only included bug fixes and new tracks, but also additional 2 cups for a total of 6, and most importantly, a level editor, using which, I must add, some hardcore fans release tracks even today. Graphics-wise, the game is as good as your system can handle, so on a basic A1200 it won't look great with chunky pixels and small gameplay window, but on 060 CPU or via emulation it can be quite pretty. It won't run on basic small OCS ECS Amigas at all, however. So, is Xtreme Racing as good as Super Mario Kart? No, it's not, but it's best kart racer Amiga had, and a pretty good one at that. Pinball Brain Damage is one of the best looking pinball games on the Amiga, especially that it works in high-res mode natively and can be even switched into a super high-res so that you could see the whole table on screen at once without scrolling, if your system and screen can handle it, that is. And since we're on the subject, there are only 2 tables available in the game. Hyper Evolution, a car steam table in which you first have to get your driver's license, then tune your car up, and finally race around and run away from the police. The second is Magnetic Whirlpool, B-movies-inspired table, full of monsters and such, and overusing the ramps and tunnels to an ungodly degree in my opinion. The top side of the screen feels as if the designers ran out of ideas and their solution was to chuck as many of these there as they could fit, and then add few extra more on top. It looks bad and it's confusing mess. I have no idea what to aim there for, what to score on, it's odd. Pinball Brain Damage's ball physics are really good, however, probably the best on the Amiga. Now, while they're excellent and no doubt important part of any pinball game, they do not make or break it alone. So comparably speaking, Pinball Fantasy's physics were nowhere near as good, and yet it was a much better game. With fun, easy to understand and learn tables, plenty of scoring opportunities, and excellent presentation, graphics and soundware. Oh, and same as in virtually any other pinball game in existence, it could be played in multiplayer. Pinball Brain Damage is single player only. Weird design choice, but whatever. Fortunately, pinball games can be easily played alternating, so it is what it is. All in all, Pinball Brain Damage is a fun, even if tad flawed game. Personally, I find its 2 tables only fun limiting factor, especially that realistically speaking, I'll only be playing on one of them anyway, so a much wider selection would do it good. But if you're a fan of the genre or like to occasionally play around with flippers, it's an excellent addition to any Amiga owner's collection. Sierra Soccer World Challenge Edition, interesting title as there was no other version of the game, short of a gaming Mac cover disc demo, is my most favorite football game on the Amiga, for a variety of reasons that I will list chaotically over the next minute or so. It's difficult enough to pose a challenge, but in the same time accessible and easy to control so that strategy, management and role-playing centered geeks like myself will not feel lost and powerless playing it, like we kinda do in Sensible Soccer. Or is it just me? Anyway, Sierra Soccer uses an early but rather good 3D engine, and while it's not very sophisticated, it's very simple for the end user to understand and grasp control of, and allows for taking of all those free kicks and penalties to be a pure pleasure, as you feel that you have complete control over where the ball will be going, more or less. And yeah, seasoned kickoff or Sensible Soccer players can probably aim the ball in the respective titles with pinpoint accuracy, but as I mentioned initially, I am and always was mainly a strategy and role-playing gamer, so those high-octane arcadey football games were beyond means of reasonable control for me. They're too fast, too technical, too difficult is what I'm trying to say here. Sierra Soccer skill-wise landed somewhere in between my beloved Football Managers and arcade games, and that was, it seems, a sweet spot for me. So, I could comfortably play it without constantly feeling like an underdog, and yet never feel as if there was no challenge ahead of me. In the end, all you need to know that it's a very unique football game that runs great, looks decent, and even complete footy noobs like myself can enjoy it. It's not as widely spread or well known as the other footballing behemoths on the Amiga, but just as fun. Ruff'n'Tumble starring Ruff Rogers, a hero I've never heard of before, or for that matter, one I've never heard of after either, well, until a few years ago at least, when he resurfaced again in a new game, this time rebranded as Ruff Rogers, but other than that, identically looking. Anyway, Ruff'n'Tumble is an Amiga exclusive run-and-gun console quality action shooter. Sure, it's not really left-to-right fair as most other games in the genre are, and allows for a free all-way movement and scrolling. But other than that, all the defining characteristics of the genre are kept and present within it. Namely, the running and the gunning. Yeah. Story behind the game is pretty standard for the genre and centers around you playing as Ruff, who lost his marbles after going through a mystical portal leading to evil Dr. Destiny's alien planet. And I meant losing your marbles in the most literal sense of the word. They were really colorful marbles, and you really just lost them. Now, from that point onward, you set on a 16-level strong adventure to find all of them and defeat evil Dr. Steamhead robots. In each of the stages, all you have to do is to find and collect all RGB-colored marbles and keys. And this literally translates to kill everything that moves and pick up everything you can. When you grab a particular required number of marbles, a door to the next stage will open and you'll be able to progress. Sounds simple, right? Well, it's anything but. Because other than the first couple of levels or so, Ruff'n'Tumble gets unforgiving really fast, throwing seemingly countless numbers of enemies at you from all sides all the time. Fortunately, you're not defenseless, and while your initial gun is rather weak, there are numerous upgrades scattered around the levels, and these new weapons are considerably more deadly and useful. Even armed with them, however, Ruff'n'Tumble is an extremely demanding game, and to be successful in it, you need to take a bit different approach to it than the genre name suggests. So, while you will still stick to gunning, pew-pewing at enemies at all times, running is not the best idea. So slow down, because in Ruff'n'Tumble, slower is actually much faster. But if you're a master gamer, hackerman, or however else the true joystick assassins call themselves these days, then yeah, by all means go ahead and run and gun. As you can see, presentation is definitely Ruff'n'Tumble's strongest suit. It's incredible. It looks like a game that should be running on SNES or Sega Genesis and not on the Amiga. And yet, it does. And only on the Amiga. And all that because... F-17 Challenge is an interesting arcade racer. It's interesting because it's a touch away from being great and just falls short of reaching that mark because of some small but overall quite significant issues. But we'll get back to it in a minute. The game is Team 17's first attempt at the racing genre and features very nice and fluidly animated graphics, chock full of little touches like rain or sparks flying off the cars when they collide, pretty decent sprite scaling and quite good car models. For the time and system, that is. Even though there's whopping 22 cars racing at the same time, F-17 telegraphs the feeling of speed perfectly, and I don't have to tell you that it's hella important in any and all racers. The sounds are okay, but nothing that would have lifted it above the generic racer average. There are two gameplay modes to choose from in F-17, Arcade and Normal. In first, you have to finish in the top 3 each time to progress further, whereas in Normal you accumulate racing points appropriate to the position that you ended up on after each race is completed. While all the tracks are seemingly recreations of real-life circuits, to me all they seem identical and it's very difficult to tell one from another unless you've played the game for hours. That said, the biggest issue with F-17 are the opposing cars. They seem to be doing nothing else than trying to get in your way, like literally they constantly try to block you, and that's not a great game design. Because while I understand that it happens in real-life races, it's not all that the drivers are doing. Some actually try to win them, you know? In real life, it would be extremely risky and life-threatening behavior and an unlikely occurrence. In F-17, it happens all the freaking time. I'm not saying that it makes the game much more difficult, but it makes it needlessly annoying. Despite all I said, I actually like F-17. I do, but only for a race or two every now and then. Mortal Kombat, despite what the title and how it's written may suggest, has as much to do with Mortal Kombat as hot dogs have with fine dining. Sure, you'll munch on one dripping with mustard and ketchup every once in a while when in a rush and while watching a sporting event, but you're not gonna take a girl on a hot dog date, right? Unless you will, then kudos to you, sir, for not giving any shits whatsoever. You're probably the coolest hot potato that has ever walked the earth. Anyway, Mortal Kombat is more similar to Final Fight than Mortal Kombat, so it's a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Though scrolling is a very strong word when talking about this game, and comparing it to even Amiga's weak port of Final Fight is borderline criminal too. But what is Mortal Kombat then? Well, in grim post-apocalyptic future, in a Terminator-like scenario where all human life is long gone, only machines survived. And them being originally made by us, they've inherited some of our traits, namely aggression, hate and prejudice. So you know, A+ stuff. And since there's only 2 factions of machines left, they fight for control of whatever scraps are left of the dead Earth. They are based on Amigas and early 90s PCs, and these computers are the computing powers behind running the machines. Cool, right? It is, but sadly the gameplay is not there to support the idea. You can pick one of 6 available robots, that vary very little in how they fight and control, and you have to take them through 14 boring-ass levels. It's not great. Being able to play Metal Kombat with a friend, however, subjecting them to the same cringe and bad gameplay experience seems to be the only nearly redeeming thing going for the game. Cause why suffer alone when misery loves the company? Metal Kombat is a pretty bad game and it's hardly worth your time. But it's rare and an exclusive, so even if for science only, you should really play it at least once. World Cup Soccer is a follow-up to earlier Brutal Sports Football and a second game in the Brutal Sports series. It's futuristically overly glorified interpretation of soccer that released alongside real-life 1994's World Cup, no doubt to cash in on the adjacency to the event. And same as in the early game, it's not all about scoring, it's mainly about violence. So while you technically in theory could win the game by scoring more goals, in reality you can win even when theoretically losing 10-1 score-wise. All by killing/disabling all of the opposing team's players. So fouls, as you've known them in regular-ass football, or soccer for you folks on the other side of the pond, are not a game-stopping event in World Cup Soccer. They're a feature, and one that's worth exploiting and quite a lot of dough on top of that. So while you can tackle in any way you please, you can also punch, kick, stab or even behead your opponents. That last move in particular is worth a nifty 200k at the end of the match, and money that then can be spent on new better players, extra opens and such between games. Mortars, swords, shields, all that's in the game, and that's just scratching the surface when it comes to armament, as like I said initially, it's more about who wins and not about who scores more here. World Cup Soccer is viewed from an isometric top-down perspective and it takes a little getting used to. So do the controls, but when you master them both, defeating CPU and getting on top of the league and the titular World Cup should be pretty easy. And that's why it's a game to play with a friend only. Cause not only it's more fun then, but a person can actually provide a challenge. Also, if you play together, you're both affected by a rather limited and choppy frame rate and scrolling. They're annoying beyond belief, but if you're both a victim, you can get used to it, right? World Cup Soccer with a friend is definitely a title to play a game or two once every full moon. Against CPU, however, I would only recommend it to the most hardcore fans of the odd sporting games. Bada beep, bada boom, and another video full of Amiga excess is behind us. Did any of the games spark your interest? Do you think you'd like to try them out? Or are you a former Amiga owner and they only made you want to fire the old beast back up again? Whichever the case, let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. If you didn't, well then there's thumbs down there too. But I suppose you wouldn't have persevered up to this point if you really didn't. Around 60% of you are not subscribed and there's currently no way of knowing if YouTube will decide to recommend you the next episode or not, other than subscribing and hitting that bell, that is. And when you hit that bell, whenever the new video is out, YouTube will actually send you a small and friendly notification about it, so you wouldn't miss it. If you'd like to support the channel, Patreon and YouTube memberships are a great way of doing so. They will help me release better content and also they get first dibs on all new videos before they're publicly accessible on YouTube. If you can't or don't want to do that though, likes and subscribes are great too. I would like to take a moment here and thank all the YouTube creators from whose videos short bits were taken to serve as a background to my commentary. They're amazing and stars among the retro community. You will find names of their channels at the top of the screen when their footage is running and also in the video description below. For me though, this is all, so have a good one and I'll see you next time. Peace.